More U.S. bishops are announcing bans on the traditional Latin Mass in an attempt to comply with the late Pope Francis's document, Traditiones Custodes. Why is there an escalation in this liturgical crackdown now? And what is Pope Leo's position on all of this? Here with analysis of this ever-expanding assault, I'm joined by liturgy expert, president of Una Voce International, Joseph Shaw. Joseph, thanks for being here. This week, a brand new Latin Mass ban was announced for the Diocese of Knoxville in Tennessee, which includes Knoxville and Chattanooga. Pastors there announced that they, along with their bishop, Mark Beckman, will begin to transition to the ordinary form of the Mass in late December. Joseph, the drive to implement Pope Francis's directive continues. 11 U.S. dioceses so far have embraced this. What do you think is driving this new push? You would have thought with the new Pope, we might have seen a cessation of this.
Yes, indeed. And I must say, I find it very puzzling, very strange indeed. I assume this is something to do with the attitude of the bishops concerned. It may also be connected with the papal nuncio in America. Is it coming from Pope Leo? Well, if it were, then I think we'd see more of it around the world. This is something which seems to be unique to America. I haven't heard about this coming from Italy or France or England, where I am. In fact, the bishops in England seem to be more relaxed now than they were 6 months ago about the traditional Mass. So this is a real puzzle.
Yeah, it's troubling. And again, you have people in the United States who actually moved cross country to be closer to these traditional Latin Mass communities because they wanted to have access to the Mass every week. And now the Masses have vanished in their communities. There is this idea, and we heard this from the Pope Leo, in a recent long-form interview he did with Elise Allen, that if you celebrate the new Mass in Latin and keep the incense and some of the trappings, that will be enough to satisfy the Latin Mass goers. Is it, Joseph?
No, it's not. It's interesting that he made that remark. I mean, he posed it as a rhetorical question. Wouldn't that be the same experience? And I'm surprised. I would be surprised if he really thought that was the same experience, but maybe he does. But we have to disabuse him of that if we would do if we were asked. And of course, the whole history of the traditional Latin Mass movement is that it's not enough. But another aspect of that history, of course, is that is not something we've been offered consistently, whether we want it or not. There are some people who like that,
Yeah.
and they have had a pretty difficult time in America and Britain and elsewhere. Promoting the Novus Order in Latin has often been regarded as tantamount to schismatic tendencies and all the other things that we're accused of. So it's hard to know whether Pope Leo was maybe thinking aloud. These letters, I mean, is this a genuine offer even? Because some of the bishops who've restricted Latin Mass, the traditional Latin Mass, have also restricted more conservative ways of celebrating the Novus Ordo.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you compare the two rites, as I recently did, and I've read some articles about this, the prefaces of the traditional Latin Mass, only 13% of those prefaces carried over into the new Mass. 13%. So it is a very different rite, though they're both the Roman rite. They're very different in substance, not only in style and presentation. Joseph, implicit in these letters announcing the closures in Chattanooga, especially the accusations of broken unity keep emerging, even suggesting in one of the letters that clinging to the ancient Latin rite is somehow Protestantism. Your take on this?
Yes. I mean, that is a really extraordinary remark because, Protestants are not characterized by their clinging to liturgical forms, with perhaps the exception of a few Anglicans who are very attached to the Book of Common Prayer. It's not a characteristic of Protestantism at all. I'm afraid that's an example of people who think that any heresy should be called by the name of their most familiar heresy, in this case, Protestantism. There are different kinds of ways of erring, but this is certainly not Protestant attitude. So our attachment to tradition is an attachment to the church. Our attachment to the church is an attachment to Christ. Christ speaks to us through the church's traditions. That isn't something which any Catholic theologian who's remotely orthodox could deny. That's where we get our doctrine from. It's how we are taught to pray in the liturgy through the traditions of the church. Now, that doesn't mean the Pope doesn't have authority over the liturgy. He certainly does, and we accept that.
Yes.
But the idea that there's a tension between attachment to the church, attachment to the unity of the church, and attachment to the church's traditions, especially ones as venerable as this, and that's a non-starter.
Yeah, well, Joseph, one of the perplexing things, I guess, in all of this, in one of these letters, there was a suggestion that if you want this old Mass, somehow you are breaking unity with the Pope. And it's this idea that Pope's personal perspective or their personal like can't be wrong. But Pope Benedict was apparently wrong because Pope Francis said he was. And I mean, is this only whatever the latest Pope says is what goes? There's a very odd economy that we've seemed to be setting up here, which relies on whoever the latest man elected is. And that really isn't the nature of the Catholic Church. Catholic Church is the repository of the doctrine of faith, not the whims of whoever's elected tomorrow.
Yes, it's absolutely right. I mean, it's like a parody of the Catholic Church. It's like what C.S. Lewis said. He didn't like the idea of becoming a Catholic himself because it was like agreeing with someone before you knew what they were going to say. Well, I mean, that's obviously absurd. We accept the faith in its entirety because we do know what it is. It's been communicated to us through the magisterium, and it's the deposit of faith, and that doesn't change. So in this case, even things that can change, we have to respect tradition, because tradition is not just a kind of neutral mechanism by which things get out of date. It's actually a way for God to communicate to us his will.
There's been no direct word yet, or ruling, if you will, from Pope Leo on this matter. But I think it bears noting that Cardinal Roche, who is the head of the Vatican Liturgy Office, his mandate was just renewed by Pope Leo. And he seems to be, at least in the Chattanooga case, they mentioned that it was Roche's office that reached out to lean on the bishop and say, hey, are you implementing Custodes, Traditionis Custodes? Meaning, when are you going to curtail that old rite? So there seems to be an embrace of what's happening now from the current Pope. What do you think's happening here?
It's difficult to tell. I mean, the other direct indication of his attitude is his allowing Cardinal Raymond Burke to celebrate the traditional Mass in St. Peter's.
Yes.
Just in 10 days' time from now. So I will be there in St. Peter's, and Cardinal Burke will be celebrating that Mass. And if that isn't indication that the Pope Leo is okay with this Mass, I really don't know what would be. But that's something which stopped under Pope Francis. We didn't have that Mass as an annual event for 2 years.
Right.
So this is actually a positive step forward for the organizers of the pilgrimage.
Yeah.
It's not just something carrying on. He's spoken to Pope to Cardinal Burke. He's spoken to Cardinal Sarah. What's going on here? Well, Cardinal Roche is entitled to implement what he regards as the policy, but if you actually look at the document that he's implementing, Traditionis Custodes, it's quite clear that all these bishops in America, if they wanted to make provision for the traditional Mass, they are actually invited to do so. The problem only arises with the use of parish churches. So if they were to designate a church as a shrine, then, or if there's a church belonging to a religious order somewhere which isn't a parish church, then they could do that. And as I say, it's actually invited to do it in the very first articles of the document. So this seems to go beyond normal reading of Traditionis Custodes.
Yeah, well, Pope Leo, I know weeks ago said that during this pilgrimage of those who love the traditional Latin rite, which you mentioned a moment ago, Cardinal Raymond Burke's going to celebrate the traditional Mass there at St. Peter's, that Pope Leo said he would take that as an opportunity to dialogue and meet with the folks who were there. So I hope that happens, and we'll see. But it seems to me, Joseph, and maybe it's just my own sense of justice, but if the Vatican Library can allow a Muslim prayer room, I think Catholics who love the old rite should be entitled to celebrate that rite in their parish, not at some, at a firehouse or at some, outhouse, but actually in their parish. I don't understand what the great sin is there, and I think Traditionis Custodes needs a good looking at. It just seems like an unjust document.
Yes, yes. Those of us who have been associated with the traditional movement for a long time, of course, we're used to being given the crumbs off the table, and we're grateful for them. My first prolonged experience, a regular experience of the traditional mass, was in a secular meeting room, which was hired by the hour. Not because we were some sort of peculiar sedevacantist group. We had permission of the Archbishop because he gave us permission to have the mass, but he didn't provide a church to have it in. So it's very sad. It makes you feel unwelcome. It
Yeah.
makes you feel that the bishop does not really care about your pastoral needs. You're not really part of the family. You're the kind of orphaned kid that's being kind of allowed maybe occasionally to come in, is not given a seat at the table. It's really sad, and it has a very bad psychological effect on the faithful, this. And that really, people who complain about radicalization and ingratitude and feeling, traditionalists, being overcritical, well, they should look in the mirror and ask, well, how could that possibly be? Why do people become like that? Marginal people become radicalized. I'm sorry, if you don't like it, you should stop marginalizing them.
Well, and we saw the cessation of all of this during Benedict's reign, because he gave free rein to the old rite with the new one and said, here, let all the flowers grow. That is the answer. It worked. I mean, we saw it working. I want to quote something. This is Pope Benedict. Pope Benedict said back in 1997, I am of the opinion, to be sure, that the old rite should be granted much more generously to all those who desire it. It's impossible to see what could be dangerous or unacceptable about that. A community is calling its very being into question when it suddenly declares that what until now was its holiest and highest possession is strictly forbidden, and when it makes the longing for it seem downright indecent. That was Cardinal Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict, in Salt of the Earth. The Church has always taught the Eucharist confected in either liturgy of the Roman Rite is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. What could be wrong there, Joseph?
Yeah. Well, I share your puzzlement on what Pope Benedict said. I think it's important that it's not just bad for these peculiar, eccentric Catholics who are attached to the traditional mass. It's actually bad for everyone, because it gives the impression that there's something bad about the Church's past. There's something wrong with how Catholics celebrated Mass for century after century. That whole liturgy, that whole spirituality, that whole outlook on life is something that has to be rejected and cast off. You can't live like that as a Catholic.
No.
Now, people sometimes say, "Oh, we have this great advantage over Protestantism because you look at history and stuff." Well, I'm sorry, if you look at history and say it was all terrible, it was all darkness until the Second Vatican Council, then, well, you're not doing a very good job as a Catholic historian.
Well,
because
it's
you're
also,
just playing into Protestants' hands.
Yeah. This is corporate amnesia, because what you're basically saying is everything that came before me was useless or rigid, and these people were deluding themselves. This is where we're the only people that are happening and have it. Cardinal Robert Sarah spoke out on these liturgy wars in a new French language interview on YouTube. Here's what he had to say. We have turned the Mass into a battlefield. Traditionalist, progressive, this and that, and we are profaning the Eucharist. Why forbid this or that? Who gives us the right to prevent someone from being personally united with God? In fact, those who truly practice their faith today are often the ones who attend the traditional Mass. Why forbid them? On the contrary, they should be encouraged. Joseph, what are you seeing? I see a lot of young people flooding to the old rite. I call it the old rite. Some people get upset when I say that. The traditional Mass, the ancient Roman rite. What might happen if this ban this idea that this is a filthy rite that we can no longer embrace. If that continues, what happens to those young people who are coming to that rite and drawn to it?
Yeah, well, it's very discouraging for them. It's very discouraging for them. I think, I mean, the feeling that of, being rejected, of not being listened to, that this is a church which is not for you. I remember when I was a student, I lived in a place where there were a lot of Benedictines, young monks, and many of them were very conservative in the 90s, and they went back to their monasteries after doing a degree in Oxford, and nearly all of them ended up leaving their communities. Those communities couldn't cope with conservative young monks, and we're in danger of doing the same thing. We have this generation of young people who are more conservative than me. I feel quite I've been overtaken by these the young people. Their attitudes are different, the circumstances are different, what they're reading is different.
Yeah.
That's how life is. It doesn't stand still. So we've got to find a way of bringing them into the church, which works for them, and works for the church. From a purely selfish point of view, I don't want to be the last Catholic. I don't want to be the last one to close down my local churches and go to my grave without anyone to mourn me because there aren't any more Catholics.
Well,
We've got to make this
yeah,
work.
it's fascinating to me, Joseph, watching, the embrace of, climate change people and LGBT people and Muslims praying at the Vatican library. So there's an impulse to go out to bring people closer to you. But the people who are actual members of your family and the most vibrant young shoots in your garden, we just want to, pour kerosene on and light them a fire and drive them out. It makes no sense. But here's the data. I'm going to end here. Interesting, among young clergy, the national study of Catholic priests conducted by Gallup finds that younger priests identify as significantly more conservative in outlook than their older brethren. About 51% of priests ordained since 2010 said their political views are either conservative or very conservative. And here's the kicker, 39% of young American priests consider access to the traditional Latin Mass a priority. Your thoughts on these findings, Joseph?
Yeah, this is true all over the world. It's not just an American phenomenon, and it's very heartening. It's partly simply a kind of pendulum thing. I looked at that survey, and it was interesting to see what the alternatives were, and it was things like climate change and immigration and things. Well, those may be important issues, but they are not what Christ founded the church to preach to the world. What Christ wants those priests to do is to save souls. And I think this younger generation of priests is thinking, well, in order to have a priestly identity, in order to have a Christian community that makes sense, we've got to focus on the core issues. And one of the ways to do that is things like the traditional Mass or Eucharistic adoration. That was another issue. And well, good for them, because they could see this other stuff isn't working.
No.
And Greta Thunberg is doing all that. Well, fine, let her get on with it. But we've got other things that we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, well, Greta does this much better than most priests. Just let her do that.
Yes.
If they confect the sacraments and, hold us together in the parish, that'll be enough. Follow the work of Joseph Shaw and Una Voce International at unavoce.org. Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you.